Hello, and welcome to our session. Today we're going to be talking to you about personalisation versus anonymisation and how those two concepts sit at the heart of a digital economy and why it matters. The question we're asking, are they incompatible, or is there a continuity of ideas and continuity of how we deliver those services? The question goes to the very heart of what it means to use digital services, and therefore at the very heart of how we interact with technology and how technology builds for a better future. When we talk about the economy and the digital economy, no longer are we segmenting the digital universe from our physical or any other universe. The digital economy is the economy, and our ability to participate in such an economy means we have to be comfortable with these concepts, including the potential tension, but also how they are compatible or not. Today, with me are my two guests who are well versed in the subjects of privacy, data, personalisation or not, as the case may be. I welcome Anna Johnson and Samantha York.
Thanks for inviting us.
It's great to be here, Olga.
Welcome. It's a real pleasure to have two seasoned privacy and data professionals here talking to me about essentially, potentially two very different approaches to digital universe and how we interact with it, personal versus non-personal. But before we launch into the kind of the dilemma that sits in that really important landscape, and I really want to start with you to paint a picture of what it is that we mean by personalisation or de-identification, and why do we care? Why are those terms and concepts so pertinent to the technology and the digital landscape today?
Yeah, sure. So I might start by actually framing the discussion around what privacy is and why that matters, and therefore how that's relevant to personalisation and de-identification. So, I mean, privacy itself it's a very abstract notion. It's very hard to define. We all tend to know what it's like when it's missing, when we feel like there's been an invasion of our privacy. A lot of people think it's, maybe just the right to be left alone or secrecy or seclusion. I actually think it's much broader than that. It's really, I see it as an umbrella kind of concept. It protects a range of human rights and human values from, the freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom from discrimination, as well as a sense of controlling our own destiny. So if you like, human autonomy and human dignity. So when you start to think of privacy as an umbrella, protecting those sorts of different values and different rights, then to me, it's important that we understand it's more than just secrecy, because often if people think privacy is just about not disclosing information, they focus on certain solutions, perhaps to the expense of others. Mm-hmm. So, and also when we talk about privacy, I think about, as I said, the values and the rights we want to protect, but also the kind of harms we want to avoid or protect against. So in that context, and I'm talking here about the privacy of our personal information. In Australia, we call it personal information. Other countries and other jurisdictions might call it personal data. But we're talking here about information privacy as opposed to, say, physical privacy. Sure. So when we're talking about, the digital world, we're talking about information or data. And privacy laws, or data protection laws as they're called in other countries, are there to protect data. But that's because the data is a proxy for a human being. And really those laws are there because we want to protect the people in the data or the people represented by the data. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as well.
What are we protecting them from?
So from those kind of digital harms. Right. So in the digital world, digital harms. So again, it might be discrimination, it might be harassment, it might be intrusion. The kinds of digital harms that we want to avoid when we talk about personalisation can be things like perhaps price discrimination, overt discrimination, intrusion into people's decision-making autonomy. Right. So if I can backtrack now and say, well, what do we mean by personalisation? So obviously, the notion of personalisation is that you can use information to tailor a response, a decision and intervention for an individual person. So we hear about, say, personalised medicine, for example, the idea that drugs can be tailored to target an individual patient's individual disease. In the online world, though, when we're talking about personalisation, we're talking about data online. And it might be used, I guess the most common example is online behavioural advertising. So targeted ads, taking data about data about a person and building a profile to target an ad to that person. And other examples will be curated news feeds or recommendation engines. So if you imagine Netflix or YouTube, you watch some videos and an algorithm will build up a profile of what you like, match it against people like you and say, well, it's because you watch this program, we suggest you might also want to watch this one or this one. So there's some of the sort of ways that personalisation plays out online. And some of that can be fantastic. We, love our Netflix recommendations and things like that. But some of it, and some of it can be benign. So the targeted ads, the algorithm might decide, do you see an ad for a pair of sneakers or an ad for yoga gear? And that's not really going to harm anyone. So not all personalisation is bad or harmful, but where there's potential for digital harms to occur is where that kind of personalisation is used to either promote harmful products or harmful messaging, misinformation, disinformation. And some of the ways we've seen that play out online has been, we know that, for example, let's say the algorithm or the profiling methodology has profiled someone, a young woman, as interested in well-being. They may, and maybe has some sort of vulnerabilities around their mental health. That profile can be used to show that person particular content. Now, that content might be beneficial. It might be content which is helpful messaging around centres that the woman can go to assist with her mental health or services she can reach out to. But it could equally be used to target that person with ads or messaging or content that is sort of pro-anorexia content, for example. So the kinds of harms that we see that can result from personalisation might be kind of pushing people down certain rabbit holes that push them more and more into more and more extreme content, which might be harmful to their health. It might be promoting false claims about stolen elections. It might be promoting hatred against other communities and groups. It might be promoting genocide ultimately. So they're the sorts of digital harms I think can all agree we want to avoid and protect people against. And that's why it's really important to be really mindful, as I said, that the reason we have privacy laws or data protection laws are to protect human beings from the misinformation of their, or misuse rather, of their information.
So part of the conversation is actually what's the interest being protected and what are the consequences of the use of the data when it's personalised versus de-identified or anonymised. Can I just backtrack a little bit? And we obviously have heard quite a few technology companies and broader business community talking about data being anonymised or aggregated or de-identified. What's the significance of that practice? Where does that fit into that conversation about possible harms and possible uses of data?
Yeah, so de-identification or anonymisation, two phrases meaning very much the same thing. The idea is to break the link between a piece of data and the ability to identify the person that data relates to. And it's a sensible sort of risk management strategy. It's a good data security technique. It might be used just to protect the security of the data as it's being moved from organisation A to organisation B, in case it's subject to some kind of man-in-the-middle attack. Okay. So that might be one sort of use case for de-identification. Another is if you want to, as an organisation, you want to avoid the burden of complying with a privacy or data protection law. You say, well, if we just don't hold the personal information or the personal data in the first place, if we can no longer identify someone from the data, then we don't need to comply with all the rules that go with that kind of data.
You've removed the risk.
Yeah. Exactly. So that's the theory. There's definitely some challenges with that. The more data there is out there in the wild, the greater the sort of computing power that organisations have the easier it becomes to re-identify information or re-identify individuals from, anonymised or de-identified data. So I'm always very nervous to see it posed as a complete solution or sort of as a way of stepping outside of or being able to completely avoid or exclude yourself from the scope of privacy laws. I see it as a sensible risk management strategy, but it needs to be only one tool within your organisation's risk toolkit.
Because it can be reverse.
It can be
reverse engineering or other data sets matched and rematched in order to effectively undo the de-identification.
Yeah.
So if I go back to the question posed by this session and test how compatible or incompatible the two concepts are you suggesting that there is a continuum, or really they're not that compatible at all, it's one or the other? What's your take on the compatibility of de-identified versus personalisation?
I think it's absolutely a continuum.
Right.
So identifiability itself I see as existing along a continuum. I don't think there's a bright line between identified or identifiable and de-identified. I think we have to see all data that is about individual humans as existing somewhere on that continuum and or kind of spectrum, and depending where you sit on that scale, you have to apply the appropriate kind of risk controls. But even when an organisation may have successfully been able to say, we have no way of identifying that it's, Sally Blogs represented in this piece of data, does that necessarily mean that they can do no harm to Sally Blogs?
Right.
So at the moment, privacy and data protection laws around the world, as I said, they'll use a phrase like personal information or personal data. Mostly the definition in the law comes back to the idea that someone is identifiable from that data. But so if no one is identifiable from the data, the idea is the privacy rules don't apply because in theory that person can't be harmed. In the digital world, what we're seeing now is that theory no longer really holds true. So I talk about individuation being the way that an organisation might be able to target their messaging. So do their personalisation, target the messaging, aim their intervention, deliver content, promote an ad, promote their content, whatever it is, to someone without being able to say, we know who they are. But we know that they have this collection of attributes and that they fit the profile for the kind of person we're trying to contact or message or make a decision about or make an intervention in relation to that person. So, as I said, that alone doesn't mean that person has suffered harm. It depends on the nature of the content and the messaging and the context in which that is being delivered. So to me, that's one of the great challenges of privacy law at the moment and data protection laws around the world is I think they need to kind of catch up with the realities of the digital world, because at the moment a lot of activity is kind of escaping the reach of privacy regulation because organisations can say, well, we don't know who the people are, therefore we don't need to comply with this privacy law. I think that misses the point that we are trying to protect, as I said, the autonomy and the human dignity of the people who that data relates to, regardless of whether or not you know that person's name or can find out their identity.
Yeah. So it's that ability to identify, therefore identifiable, rather than name, rank, serial number, and all of the attributes. Yeah.
Yeah.
How do we then translate that continuum and potentially the complexity of you might start with one type of information, finish with another, and back again? How do you transfer that into a digital environment and technology environment such as Google or in fact any other technology companies with sophisticated uses of technology and a very in-depth digital footprint? Sam, can you give us a little bit more of a picture?
Yeah, and I guess I would just underscore the question you put to Anna, that Anna responded affirmatively to, that this very much operates across a spectrum, right? And Google generates revenue from advertising, all forms of digital advertising. And one of those forms is indeed personalised advertising. Yeah. But to an extent, no digital advertising requires knowing the identity of the individuals that are being served ads to. And clearly, for Google, our kind of core principle around all privacy and data protection is being transparent around what data is being collected and explaining why, and then giving people choice and control over how their data is being used. And we recognise that even using Google services, there are a range of ways in which people will interact and a range of data being disclosed, from very little data to quite a lot of data. So advertising on our search engine, for instance, requires very little data, really just the words that you put into your search box.
Yes,
Sometimes it's also helpful to understand where you might be, because if your search query is, where is the nearest ATM machine, we want to be able to give you a helpful response to that. So we'll need to know where you are to point you in the right direction. But at the other end of the spectrum, people can obviously be signed into a Google account where they've disclosed personal information to us, and we therefore do know who they are. But we've decided to take a few preventative steps, really, to help manage some of the risks of harm that Anna has spoken so eloquently about. So, for instance, we give people the choice about how their data is being used. People can choose whether or not to receive personalised advertising. We don't allow personalisation and advertising based on sensitive data categories. So people's health condition, their ethnicity, their sexual identity, their political affiliations. We don't allow any personalisation based on those criteria, which we hope means that we're avoiding exploiting people who might be experiencing some kind of hardship or might be vulnerable in some way. And we've also recently announced that we will be disabling ads personalisation entirely for people under 18.
Okay.
So we're trying to be very thoughtful in how we use personalisation across our services, and to a great extent the data that we collect through our services is really primarily used to make the services better and to make them more helpful for people. But where there is personalisation involved, we've tried to be very thoughtful and considerate around how we're using that data and for what purposes, really, and for what purposes are we enabling other people like advertisers to be able to distribute ads to certain cohorts of people.
So if we then fast track this into kind of a commercial reality or a particular product, what I'm hearing is that they're not incompatible, that they exist in a continuum, and that the business model and the degree of autonomy supports the individual's choices as they move through those types of services. So if you had a magic wand and had an opportunity to make this conversation easier, possibly less technical and more accessible, what would be your magic wand? And I'll ask you a similar question in a minute, Anna. So from your perspective, what would be that dividing line or that solution?
Well, I think that actually not only my industry, but many industries are really at a little bit of a tipping point when it comes to personalisation now, Olga. I think, we're hearing very clearly that people are very exercised about privacy, particularly when it comes to personalisation, and I'll speak about it in the context of advertising. And I think we're seeing a real shift away from very sort of user individual specific data to being able to develop aggregated insights based on privacy safe and privacy preserving methods of collecting that data and then forming these aggregate insights. Companies are taking different approaches, so there's not total consistency. Some companies are deciding just to totally disallow the use of any identifiers that relate to individual customers. Other companies are developing just alternative identification systems. At Google, we're trying to do something a little bit in between, and where we've announced, for instance, that we're not going to allow the use of our third-party tracking identifiers across our Chrome internet browser or also on our mobile Android-powered devices. But we're trying to work with the industry to understand, well, how do we continue to allow an ad-funded internet to thrive in the future, but do so in a way that is more privacy preserving. So we're trying to develop proposals around how we can build better data sets based on aggregate insights rather than individual insights. We're soliciting feedback from industry, and we're trying to bring industry along with us because we do feel like this is the future. And if I could wave my wand, it would be that industry see this as an opportunity rather than a challenge, and jump on board and work with us to reach that future where we are able to continue running websites and providing services that do rely on advertising to be funded, but in a way that is privacy preserving.
So what I'm hearing, and possibly our audience here, is that the ability to de-identify and aggregate is actually becoming a bonus. So if we started the conversation some years ago of the hunt for being able to identify and serve certain highly specific content, we're now actually in a different stage of the digital universe where actually the premium, the sophisticated services, the services that people actually want to engage and consume are the services that enable a level of anonymity, if that's the chosen piece. So, okay, it's interesting. It comes full circle. In some ways, you've provided the answer about whether they're compatible or not. And what would be your magic wand about the tension that exists in that digital universe, personal versus not personal?
Well, I have quite a lot of things on my wish list to wave my way.
I didn't say one, right? We could have multiple. Okay,
so I guess I'd like to see movement in a few different ways. So to pick up on Sam's point, I agree that I think the industry as a whole, to the extent you can talk about the industry, is at a tipping point, and I'm really enjoying seeing a lot of organisations sort of abandon the kind of tech bro, move fast and break things attitude, and instead think, how about we move slowly and thoughtfully and respectfully and inclusively and build things instead. And I think that's been a real shift in the last few years. That's been really positive. What I would like to see in the next sort of 5 to 10 years, I guess, is some change at national or supranational level. So I mentioned already where I think law reform needs to go globally. But there's also things that can be done at organisation level and at project level. So within organisations, I would encourage, and this is something we do with our clients, we talk about culture. I think it's important to get organisations moving away from seeing privacy as a compliance issue towards a cultural issue, and really getting into organisational change. And some of that will be about, capacity and capability uplift, so upskilling your staff. I know the three of us have spoken before about the importance of privacy engineering, for example. Building up your product development, your design teams, giving them the skills to build privacy into the product design really early, instead of relying on the privacy officers or lawyers to come along and try and do a retrofit of solutions later. So that's really important. There's also that kind of fundamental sort of baseline awareness and understanding for all staff, not just your design teams. So all of that, changing culture, upskilling the organisation, that's important. So that's culture. I also think diversity is really important. So whenever someone's talking about a new technology, I think about, who are the people who are designing that or building it? Who are the people who are going to benefit from it or profit from it? Who are the people who are going to use it? Who will be impacted by it? are those circles overlapping or are they completely different? You really want them overlapping. You want your product designers not just to be thinking about who are our users. You really actually want them to be reflecting those users' experiences. So diversity really matters in your teams. And I'm not just talking about ethnicity, gender, diversity. I mean diversity of people's life experience, so
decision making.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And especially if you're talking about a technology that will impact on vulnerable people. And to Sam's point, we're seeing a lot more recognition these days about impact on children of new technologies in particular. So that's some things you can do at the organisation level.
I'm hearing a strong interdisciplinary theme here because even in that magic wand conversation, you've touched on actually quite a variety of skills, and we've come full circle to diversity and a bit of privacy by design, if we want to use a coined phrase. Can I just quickly shift back to Sam for a minute? And I appreciate that Google has this whole kind of professional class or discipline of people called privacy engineers. And that of itself mixes a couple of disciplines because we think privacy, legal concept, engineer, more mathematical and technology focused. Can you shed a bit of light about what is that role, and does that bridge the sort of divide that's perceived to exist in an ideal interdisciplinary world?
Yeah, I think it goes some way to bridging the divide. So yes, at Google we have dedicated privacy engineers who sit in every single product area. Google makes a lot of different products, and in every single product group there are a group of privacy engineers who are implementing our privacy by design methodologies. They're working closely with privacy lawyers, privacy compliance people. There are interdisciplinary teams that sit within each of those product areas that work with the privacy engineers. But it's very much a dedicated function at Google. Every single employee across the company has to take privacy training every year as part of our professional development program. And I think this is a discipline that we're going to see a lot more of. And I think it will be a more well-rounded discipline than perhaps more siloed engineers or software developers may be, because they are working across so many different aspects of privacy and data protection that it's really informing their work in ways that I think other engineers perhaps wouldn't have the opportunity to work amongst.
That's wonderful. So what we're hearing actually from both speakers here is that it's a continuum. It's very much an interdisciplinary approach, and there isn't a hard stop and a hard start, that when you're actually thinking about personal versus aggregated or de-identified, they are compatible because they serve different needs, and you address them through all of the things that you've been discussing so generously with us today. So thank you very much. Shedding some light on what is potentially a very mysterious topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga.
Thank you.